This month, April, is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And in the spirit of just awareness and kind of covering topics that we haven't previously covered in those other workshops that you guys can view, we wanted to talk today about some of the laws and policies in the state of Utah regarding sexual assaults, and resources and rights that survivors can access. So, this presentation is going to be very information heavy. It's going to be a lot of me talking. If you guys have questions, I would love to have a discussion and address them. But if you could put them in the chat, that's going to be the best way. And then we'll just interrupt what we're talking about to address the question. But that's kind of going to be the best flow for today. And I also want to say that, my title at the Rape Recovery Center is Outreach Advocate. I am not a lawyer, but what I am is someone who works on the side of the law that's about implementing and understanding the procedures. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from. So again, this is not like I don't want to give a disclaimer. This is not legal advice. I don't think anyone would take it that way, but just that I'm not coming from like a JD background. I'm coming from like a this is what we are implementing and doing on the ground kind of background. Okay, so a little bit about us if you haven't heard us before. We are the Rape Recovery Center. It's our mission to support and empower survivors and victims of sexual violence and to educate the community about the cause, impact, and prevention of sexual violence. So we offer a ton of different services like therapy, support groups, advocacy, as well as what I'm doing today, community education. And we cover Salt Lake County as well as Tooele County. So we have an office in Sugar House and then another office out in Tooele. So I went through a little bit about what we can expect for today. I'm going to go through a framework that splits up the information into 4 categories. So we're going to start with the right to say no, then the right to ask for help, the right to access healthcare, and finally, the right to define justice. Okay, so the first legal right we're going to talk about is the right to say no. Everyone has the right to say no to unwanted sexual activity. That is a universal right. Um, in the Utah Code, rape is defined as sexual intercourse with another individual without the individual's consent. And there's 2 kind of additions to that in the Utah Code. The first one is that any sexual penetration, however slight, is sufficient to constitute the relevant element of a violation. And the section applies whether or not the actor is married to the individual. So, what we can take from this is that in the state of Utah, rape is defined as any kind of sexual penetration. So it doesn't necessarily mean penis in a vagina, which is typically how we think of rape. Actually, if there's penetration of any part of the body by any part of another person's body, that can fall under the definition of rape. That's something that's a little bit unique. And the other thing that I like to point out is that we do address marital rape in the Utah Code. So marital rape is illegal. Um, and besides that and the relationship between perpetrator and victim, there's also nothing in here about gender. So in Utah, people who are married have the right to say no. People who identify as men or women or non binary or trans have the right to say no. There's really a wide range of identities that have the right to say no and fall under these legal definitions of consent and sexual assault. Um, yeah. Oh, I already did that. I should have turned the slide earlier. So one thing I'll to go into the next slide. So what this does specify is that rape is without the individual's consent. And that's what we know about sexual assault in general, right? Is sexual assault is defined as any kind of unwanted sexual contact. So, what does that really mean about the consent part? At the Rape Recovery Center, we like to go through FRIES to talk about consent. Consent needs to be A, freely given, which means that there's no coercion, there's no power imbalance that could contribute to coercion, there's no active, like, oh, I'm going to threaten you unless you comply and do this sexual activity with me, and there's no, like, oh, please, 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 like trying to persuade. All of those things can be considered coercion. And if those things are present, consent is not freely given, so the consent is not actually valid. The second part of our acronym is reversible. So consent needs to be reversible. At any time, if someone changes their mind, they're absolutely allowed to change their mind and say, no, I actually don't want to do this anymore. And then the activity needs to stop because that consent has been revoked. The third part of the acronym is informed. Informed consent means that everyone understands what they are consenting to. So this is something that comes up in workshops a lot, where people ask about being under the influence of alcohol or drugs, and how does that interact with sexual assault and consent. And my answer is always A, in the state of Utah, consent cannot be given if one or both parties is under the influence of alcohol and drugs. So that's legally where we stand in Utah. But two, the main concern with drugs and alcohol is, can someone give informed consent? If someone is in a state of mind where they aren't able to comprehend what's going on around them, if they're in an altered state where they don't really understand, then they can't give informed consent. And so that's the main issue of why consent gets really tricky when you have drugs and alcohol. The fourth thing on here is enthusiastic. Consent needs to be enthusiastic. Something that we talk about a lot, especially when we're in high schools, is that we used to approach consent with this framework of like, no means no. And I say we as like, you know, a general field in sexual assault services, we were really hammering out this message of like, no means no, you have to respect when someone means no. And the reality is, although that's correct, there's a lot of situations where people don't necessarily feel comfortable expressing no, or they feel, I don't know, I can just speak for myself. Like, there's times where I'm like, oh, I guess I'll say yes. I don't know, I'm not really sure. And so we're trying to move away from the no means no framework and towards an enthusiastic consent framework, because of it's a higher standard that ensures that people are truly giving consent, and that they're not feeling any kind of pressure or like internal dialogue or discomfort that frequently can happen. And the last part of the FRIES is specific. So consent needs to be specific. This goes very closely with informed. Consent to one activity is not the same as consent to another activity. Consent to a specific activity on one day or time is not the same thing as consent to the same activity at another day or another time. So consent is tied to the activity and the time and the place. It can't just be transferred across multiple situations. It has to be specific to the situation. So this is the model that you can see we borrowed it from Planned Parenthood, but this is what, as a field in public health and prevention, this is what we talk about. When we compare it to what's in the Utah Code, Utah Code defines without consent as a lot of different situations. I've definitely cut out some things here. It's a very, very long part of the code where they describe different things that could be considered sexual assault. But the basic definition is the victim expressing lack of consent through words or conduct. So if we're comparing that to the enthusiasm standard and the affirmative consent standard, Utah has adopted kind of that lower negative consent standard. And so that's what would be used in a court of law. Again, there's a discrepancy there. There's a lot of times that, we're working with survivors, and a very, very common trauma response to sexual assault is to freeze. And that's another reason why enthusiastic consent is necessary, is because if someone is displaying body language or just in a state where they can't say no, or they're feeling so afraid and overwhelmed, um, that's something that we see really commonly, and it absolutely does count as sexual assaults emotionally and in our fields. But there's a discrepancy with the legal standard, and so that's kind of a piece of education where people sometimes think, oh, because the law wouldn't consider this sexual assault, maybe it doesn't count as sexual assault. And I just think it's important for people to recognize that we have legal standards, and they're great and they're fine and they function in the legal courtroom, but there's more there's more to the story, I would say. And the second thing I'm pointing out here when it comes to the definition of consent in the Utah Code that I'm really proud of, and I think Utah does really well, is that they do address consent being reversible and specific. They do talk about how consent to a sexual act prior does not constitute consent to another sexual act, and it can be withdrawn at any time. So that's something that's I'm really proud that we've added to our code. I think it's a really important thing to be talking about when we're talking about the criminality of sexual assault. But I think, yeah, that's the end of that. Does anyone have any questions regarding consent and the way we've defined it here? Okay, great. And I'm going to keep bulldozing through because my goal is to not take up the whole hour and get us done by 12:45. So the second right I'm going to talk about is that everyone has the right to ask for help. All forms of sexual assault are traumatic. There's a wide range of behaviors that can be considered sexual assaults, and that could be considered rape. And all of them are valid, and all of them are probably going to be traumatic. And so that means that all survivors are deserving of help. I think one of the misconceptions that I frequently hear about when I'm out in the community is people will share something that happened to them and they'll think, but I don't know if it's bad enough for me to receive services or help. And that just breaks my heart, because I think if something has happened to you and has affected you, of course, then you're deserving and you're always able to come and walk into the Rape Recovery Center's doors. There's no barrier of comparison between, oh, whose experience was what. That's not something that we're interested in. And so it's important to recognize that everyone can ask for help, and that resources are available to help survivors move forward and heal from trauma. So, oh, you guys disappeared. Are you still there? Oh,
Yeah, we're still here.
okay. Sorry, my whole computer screen went black. That was very odd. I don't know what happened. Okay.
We can still
Anyways,
see your slides, so you're good.
great, great, awesome. So, one thing that we talk about when we're talking about asking for help is confidentiality. So, the Rape Recovery Center is a nonprofit organization. We are funded through state and government grants as well as some private donations, but we are not an official like government agency. We are fully outside the legal system and the court system. We are protected under the law. There is a special act of legislation that was passed just for confidential communications for sexual assaults. And in this law, it means that anyone who is an employee or a volunteer of a rape crisis and services center, such as the Rape Recovery Center, there's other rape crisis and services centers across the state and different counties. But as long as they're an employer or volunteer, they have training, and they have supervision, they all communications are going to be protected, which means that we can't be called in or subpoenaed to court. Like, we don't share anything with family or friends. We don't share anything with the police department. We are 100% confidential. And that's really, really hard to break. Like, I've never heard of it being broken. I think we're like really solid at this point. And so, us being fully confidential allows us to serve a wider range of community members and people who don't necessarily feel comfortable engaging with the legal system, engaging with the justice system. Um, and additionally, people who don't want their friends, family, people in their life to know about what's going on. Like, we are always going to be totally confidential. Um, I put on here our numbers. I'm just going to go past this, but these are available. They're on our website. We do have a 24-hour sexual violence helpline in Utah that's English and Spanish, which is really cool. Oh, this is what I skipped that I thought I was going to hit. So the only exception to confidentiality is mandatory reporting. So everyone in the state of Utah is considered a mandatory reporter for abuse of minors and vulnerable adults. So that means the exception to the Confidential Communications for Sexual Assault Act is that if someone is a minor under the age of 18, or they're classified as a vulnerable adult, which is maybe they have some kind of cognitive or physical disability, or someone who's over the age of 65, then we are obligated to make a report to DCFS or to the police. That's the only exception that we have. The There are benefits and drawbacks to mandatory reporting. And so what I always want to share is that if someone calls the 24-hour helpline or calls our office to ask questions and they remain confidential, they don't share information about their address, their name, their phone number, anything like that, then we don't have any information or recourse for reporting. So that is one way to remain confidential while obeying the law and not having any issues with mandatory reporting. That's something that some people find really valuable and necessary. Okay, I'm gonna move on to right number 3, and we're doing really good on time. So do we have any questions so far?
Doesn't look like we've got any in the chat, but
Okay,
again, just
great.
a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, throw them in there.
Okay, so the third thing I'm going to talk about is everyone has the right to seek healthcare. Healthcare is so crucial when it comes to sexual assault, not just because of the potential for collecting evidence, but also just because sexual assault is a physical crime that often has internal and external physical injuries associated with it. And being able to access healthcare to address those injuries is critical for healing and recovery. So in Utah, we have something, or it's not in Utah, all over the nation, we have something called a Code R exam. It can also sometimes be called a rape kit or a forensic exam. All of these terms are kind of used interchangeably in this field. But if someone has been sexually assaulted, they can go to any hospital emergency room to receive healthcare and participate in a Code R exam. What happens for a Code R is that the ER will call out a sexual assault nurse examiner in Salt Lake County. That's going to be from the Wasatch Forensic Nurses, who are amazing. In Tooele County, it's going to vary a little bit depending on the ER that you're in, but there are amazing, sane nurses out there in Tooele. And those nurses are trained specifically to be able to look for common injuries related to sexual assault and to be able to collect forensic evidence. So they can come in and do swabs for DNA, they can photograph injuries, they they can do all of that to collect evidence. But if they are seeing injuries, they can also address those. They can recommend further follow-up treatment. They can order people, or they can suggest that the doctor orders like an MRI. They can offer medication, including STI prophylactic medication, as well as Plan B if pregnancy is a concern regarding the sexual assault. So the SANE nurses have a ton of different tools that they can offer survivors. And the Code R exam can be performed up to 6 days after a sexual assault, and it will still be, if someone walks into the ER 6 days after an assault, they still have access to a forensic exam and to that kind of evidence collection. And it doesn't matter if they've been showering every day for the 6 days. Research has shown that it's still possible to get that DNA evidence and other kinds of evidence. So we still, in Utah, our policy is 6 days. With a Code R exam, I described the wide range of tools that a sexual assault nurse examiner can offer. Every single one of those is optional. So our Code R exam process in Utah is very much trauma informed and survivor centered. And we know that sexual assault is a crime of control. So it's our goal to give that control back over to the survivor and make sure that they are in charge of what is happening to their body. So at every step, our SANE nurses are asking for consent to do every different part of that exam. And I've been in the hospital where people say, actually, all I really want is the STI medications, and I don't want you to document anything. And that's totally fine. And there's other times people are in the hospital and they are like, I want you to get as much evidence as you possibly can. That's also totally fine. Every survivor is going to have different needs. And it's important for people to know that it's whatever their needs are is going to be accessible to them. We have purposefully designed a system in Salt Lake County and in Utah generally that is going to put them in charge of their body and give them control over this part of the sexual assault reporting and recovery process. Another part of the Code R exam that offers more choices and flexibility to survivors is that in Utah, we offer something called a restricted kit. So let me back up a little bit. When someone's doing a Code R exam, it's typically a 3 to 4 hour process. And at the end of it, all of that evidence that has been collected goes directly to the police department, who send it to the crime lab to be processed. And the evidence goes back to the police department. And then they'll reach out to a survivor to share what the results are, what the next steps are. So all of that information, the kind of the history of what happened, plus the medical evidence, is going to be released to the crime lab and the police. If there are survivors who don't want that necessarily, they're not sure, they need some time to decide, we do offer something called a restricted kit, which means that the nurse is going to go through that whole process, whatever the survivor wants, of collecting DNA, offering medication, writing down a history of what happened, taking photos of injuries. But at the end, instead of having that kit be sent to the crime lab to be processed and the results going to the police department, instead, it's going to go sit on a shelf in the police department. And it's going to sit there on the shelf until the survivor says, yeah, I'm ready for this to be unrestricted. And then it will go into processing. There's only one time you can restrict a kit, and it's at the hospital before it goes to the hands of the police and the crime lab. So an example of how this could be used, I was in the hospital once and we had a survivor who felt had been assaulted by a roommate, and she was still living with them, and she did not feel safe knowing that the police were going to be like contacting and interviewing this person because she had shared their name in her sexual assault kit, and she had talked about what had happened to her. And so she wanted some more time to be able to move out of the house before her kit was processed and before this investigation started. So she chose to do a restricted kit because it gave her a window of time where she could kind of figure out what she wanted to do personally with her life regarding this situation before the police investigation started. So there's a lot of different reasons, but that's one example of why this is useful and why it's a legal right that it's really important for survivors to know about. There are um, consequences, obviously, to doing a restricted kit. And the number one consequence is that your investigation is going to be delayed. And if you don't ever unrestrict it, there will never be an investigation. But for some people, it's the right choice to do. So our job is to educate people and make sure they know that this is a legal right they have. Yes, it's a survivor's choice to process their forensic exam or to wait until a later date, and it is a survivor's choice to share evidence and information with law enforcement. Okay, last piece of CODAR exams and healthcare for survivors is that it is free. We have an amazing office, the Utah Office for Victims of Crime, and one of their mandates in their code is offering financial reparations to victims of crime. So for sexual assault victims, this includes the cost of all parts of the CODAR exam. So the cost of the medication, the cost of, the ER bill, any kind of treatment or scans or tests, anything that was done, all of that falls under the CODAR exam. And so all of it is paid for by the state. Um, Beyond the CODAR exam, the Utah Office for Victims of Crime can potentially also cover mental health treatment. Typically, it's 24 sessions of therapy for a survivor of a crime, or up to 12 sessions for a secondary survivor of a crime. So that's someone who is like a friend or a family member and was affected. They also can sometimes pay for wages lost due to the crime. If someone called in at work and spent all day at the ER having this done, they can apply to have those lost wages paid for. That's an option. And then any other follow up care or medical care, continuing medication, continuing like follow up testing for STIs, all of that can also be covered. So everyone has the right to apply to this office for reparations. Eligibility is determined by three things. The crime has to have taken place in Utah, or sometimes there's an exception if the crime took place outside of Utah, but the victim is a Utah resident and the place where the crime took place doesn't offer their own crime victim reparations. So, for example, there's not that many states that don't have programs, but if there was a Utah resident who was the victim of a crime in Montana and they tried to apply to UOVC, UOVC would say, hey, you actually need to apply to the Montana Office for Victims of Crime and work with them instead because that's where the crime took place. But if there was a Utah resident who was assaulted or had a crime happen to them, I don't know, maybe Delaware. I don't know what Delaware's laws are. And for some reason, Delaware doesn't have an Office for Victims of Crime, then they would be eligible to apply in Utah. So the location of the crime. The second criteria for eligibility is that the crime took place after January 1st, 1987, and that the crime was reported to police. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Sexual assault is different. The standard in general is that it was reported to police and they cooperated with the police investigation, but it shifts a little bit for sexual assault. So those are the only three eligibility criteria, which means that there's nothing in there about how long after the crime the victim can apply for reparations. You can still apply even if it's been months or years after the crime. It's still an application process, but you can be found eligible and you can receive those benefits. Um, okay, yeah. Does anyone have any questions about CODAR exams and healthcare rights for survivors? Okay,
You're,
amazing. You guys are making me feel really good at my
I was
job.
gonna say, you're doing a very thorough job with explaining all of this. Thank you.
All right. So, the last right we're going to talk about is the right to define justice. Um, everyone has the right to decide what justice means to them. Um, there is a typical definition of justice in America, which is our criminal and legal justice system. Um, that is absolutely one option. And there are survivors who choose to work within the criminal and legal justice system and to cooperate with police and prosecutors within that system. There's also survivors who may have had really negative experiences with the police before, or they don't want to experience the re-traumatization that can sometimes happen, or they just don't really want to do this. And so it's my like personal mission in this job is to let people know that survivors can access resources, they can access help, they can access a ton of different benefits without participating in the legal justice system if that's something that they're not comfortable with. A lot of people assume that, oh, I don't want to talk to the police, so I'm not going to talk to anyone. But we've worked really hard to be totally separate and confidential from the police and to put these other legal protections and rights in place so that there are options for those survivors and that they don't have to just not talk to anyone. They can talk to people, they can open up and move forward with help on their healing journey. So this is a law that's pretty recent. I want to say it's like 2020, 2021. But this is written into the Utah Code that a victim of sexual assault is not required to report the sexual assault to a law enforcement officer or cooperate with the appropriate law enforcement agencies and prosecuting attorneys to be eligible for reparations if they seek assistance from an advocacy services provider and they complete a questionnaire provided by the office regarding the sexual assault. So, what I had just briefly touched on was that one of the eligibility criteria to get reparations from the Utah Office of Victims of Crime, that third criteria is you have to report to the police. And if they investigate, you have to cooperate with them. That is a huge barrier for survivors of sexual assault because of so many reasons. But one example, if someone has been sexually assaulted by someone really close to them, maybe it was a family member, and they don't feel safe reporting to police, or they don't feel like they're ready to do that, then they might not ever ask for help. They might not go get their Code R exam to get the evidence collected. Um, there's other situations. There's just a myriad of reasons where people might not want to share details of their sexual assault with the police and cooperate with an investigation. And so this was a huge barrier to people accessing services because they weren't getting their Code R exams, which means they weren't getting medical treatment from sane nurses and hospital staff that's really beneficial. And then they also weren't getting connected to centers like us, to the Rape Recovery Center. And they weren't accessing any of those other financial benefits that they could be potentially eligible for at UOVC. So this law was put in place to provide an alternative pathway if people do not want to cooperate and share about their sexual assault with the police. What can happen instead is that we, as an advocacy services provider, can fill out a form. It's just a special form. We do need to be the ones to fill it out. This is not something people can do on their own, but we can fill it out on their behalf with some information that will fulfill the same goal of having tracking kind of the nature of sexual assault in Utah, like reporting what like the crime statistics are. It'll still help the agency accomplish that, but it'll provide confidentiality and anonymity to the survivor. So this is kind of the compromise that we've found where we're still going to help with reporting and statistics and tracking all of that data, but this provides confidentiality to the survivor. So this is a legal right that, again, not a lot of people are aware of. They think that if I'm talking to people, if I'm sharing my story, I have to sit and talk to a police officer. Absolutely not true. Definitely not a requirement. There are alternative pathways. It is a survivor's choice to work or not work with law enforcement, and there's benefits, and everyone's going to be different. Everyone's going to be different. Some people are going to find a lot of healing and find a lot of personal justice through working with the criminal justice system. Some people are not, and so it's just important that everyone understands what their rights are so they can make informed decisions about what is going to be best for them. Because healing is not the same thing as justice, and healing can be found within the justice system, but it can also be found outside the justice system. And there's just a wide range of pathways there. Okay, I sped through all of that. So thank you everyone for listening to me just like yap and yap and yap. Do we have any final questions regarding anything that I've talked about or anything I haven't talked about that you have questions about?
It doesn't look like we have any questions that are coming through quite yet, but please feel free to unmute yourself if that's something that you feel more comfortable with. I do love the clarification that you have provided. I myself I don't have any questions because of the depth that you went into. So thank you. I really, really appreciate it. And I love that you broke it down into layman's terms. I feel like it can be quite overwhelming to look at the policies and laws and try to read through them and understand what it means. And so I've really, really appreciated you taking time to clearly define those in an understandable and a digestible way. And it looks like Vicki and Keith also agree with that. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is like my pet project is we've done a lot of outreach and education around like what is sexual assault, and like here we have services, but it's kind of my personal mission to help people understand like what are the rights, because it's just not everyone has to go to the hospital. Not going to the hospital is not going to be the best choice for everyone. But since I have been an advocate, like sitting in the hospital so many times with survivors, I think it's one of the most beneficial things you can do is to get a CODAR exam done, get access to healthcare, like get connected to resources. And people just don't know that it exists, don't know that it's free, don't know that it's, they have options to not talk to police. And so I feel like this is just important so that people can access things that are available to them that they just don't know about. So thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for such an informative workshop. For those of you that have attended and you have found this information super valuable, such as I have, please feel free to share this recording. It will be posted on our webpage later today. You can share that with coworkers, family, friends, loved ones, whomever you want to share this education with. I think the more people that know and are educated, the better each situation can be. So thank you again so much, and we'll chat with you soon next month.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Becky.